The sweat was still dripping from Roberto Delgado's face when he heard the voice. It was 6:30 p.m. on a scorching Tuesday in July 1963, and Roberto had just finished his 14th hour picking grapes in the Salinas Valley. His hands were bleeding, his back was screaming, and he was calculating whether the $2.50 he'd earned that day would be enough to buy medicine for his daughter's fever. Then he heard someone singing in perfect Spanish from the next row over, Cielito Lindo, an old Mexican folk song his grandmother used to sing, but this voice was different. It was trained, professional, with the kind of smooth confidence that Roberto had only heard on the radio in expensive cars driving past the fields. Roberto looked through the grapevines and saw something impossible. A man in clean work clothes, a wide-brimmed hat, and leather gloves that looked like they'd never seen honest dirt. The man was picking grapes with the careful technique of someone who'd learned the job that afternoon, but he was singing like he'd been born to perform. "Who the hell is that?" whispered Carlos, Roberto's cousin, wiping dust from his eyes. Before Roberto could answer, the foreman, a cruel man named Patterson, came storming down the row. "Hey!" Patterson shouted at the singing man. "This ain't no concert hall. You're here to work, not entertain." The man stopped singing and looked up. Roberto's breath caught. Even from 30 feet away, even with dust and sweat masking his features, Roberto recognized that face. It was Dean Martin. What was one of the most famous entertainers in America doing in a grape field in the middle of nowhere, California? Dean had been driving from Los Angeles to San Francisco for a recording session when his Cadillac broke down just outside Salinas. While waiting for the tow truck, he'd walked into town to find a cold drink and had ended up at a small cafe frequented by farm workers. He'd sat at the counter, listening to the conversations around him, and what he heard made his blood run cold. Men talking about working 16-hour days for starvation wages. Women discussing how to choose between buying food or paying rent. Children who couldn't go to school because they had to work in the fields to help their families survive. It reminded Dean of his father's stories about the early days in America, about the desperate struggle to build a life when society considered you expendable. But this was worse. These people weren't just poor. They were invisible, working in conditions that would have been illegal in any other industry. "Excuse me," Dean had said to the man sitting next to him, an older Mexican worker named Antonio. "I couldn't help but overhear. You work in the fields around here?" Antonio had looked Dean up and down, taking in the expensive suit and manicured hands. "Si, senor, 25 years picking crops. You from the government? Immigration?" "No, I'm—" Dean paused. "How do you explain that you're a millionaire entertainer to a man who makes 50 cents an hour?" "I'm just curious about the work. Is it always so difficult?" Antonio laughed bitterly. "Difficult? Senor, we work from sunrise to sunset, 7 days a week, for wages that wouldn't feed a dog. The bosses, they treat us like animals. No breaks, no water on hot days, no protection from the chemicals they spray. And if we complain, if we ask for better, they fire us and hire someone more desperate." Dean had felt something burning in his chest. "What would help? What would make things better?" "Nothing will make things better," Antonio replied. "We are invisible people doing invisible work. Nobody cares what happens to us." That night, Dean had called his manager and canceled the recording session. Instead, he drove to a work clothes store, bought sturdy pants, a long-sleeve shirt, work boots, and a hat. The next morning, he showed up at the hiring station where contractors recruited day laborers. "You looking for work?" asked a skeptical contractor, studying Dean's soft hands and unmarked face. "Yes, sir. I can pick fruit, vegetables, whatever you need." "You done this kind of work before?" Dean thought about his father's barber shop, about sweeping floors and carrying heavy equipment as a child. "I've done physical work, yes." The contractor shrugged. Bodies were bodies, and if this soft city boy wanted to destroy himself in the fields, that was his business. That's how Dean Martin, millionaire entertainer, found himself bent over grapevines in the brutal Central Valley heat, learning firsthand what it meant to be invisible in America. The work was harder than anything Dean had ever experienced. By his second day, his hands were blistered despite the gloves. His back ached constantly. The sun was relentless, and the bosses allowed only 2 10-minute water breaks during the entire day. But what shocked Dean most wasn't the physical hardship. It was the systematic dehumanization. Workers were forbidden from speaking to each other during work hours. They were charged for drinking water, for transportation to remote fields, for the privilege of using primitive bathroom facilities. Their pay was docked for fruit deemed substandard by supervisors who seemed to enjoy finding reasons to reduce wages. "You're new," said Roberto Delgado on Dean's third day, working alongside him in the tomato fields. "Where you from?" "Los Angeles," Dean replied truthfully. "You come up here for the money?" Roberto laughed. "Must be desperate, man. This work, it's not for people with choices." Dean looked at Roberto, an intelligent man about his own age, speaking perfect English despite his accent, picking tomatoes with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing manual labor his entire life. "What did you do before this?" Dean asked. "I was a teacher. In Mexico City, I taught high school mathematics. But when my daughter got sick, when we needed money for doctors," Roberto shrugged, "I came north for the American dream. Turned out the dream was a 16-hour nightmare." Over the following weeks, Dean learned the stories of dozens of workers. Engineers forced to pick lettuce because their foreign degrees weren't recognized. Former business owners who'd lost everything and had no choice but to follow the harvest seasons. Families separated because parents had to work different fields just to survive. But Dean also saw something else. Incredible dignity in the face of impossible circumstances. Workers sharing their lunches with newcomers who had nothing. Mothers singing lullabies to children who had to sleep in the workers' cars because they couldn't afford housing. Men and women maintaining their pride and humanity despite being treated worse than machinery. "Why do you keep coming back?" Roberto asked Dean after 2 weeks. "Most city boys, they last maybe 3 days before they realize this work will kill them." Dean had been asking himself the same question. He could walk away any time. His Cadillac had been fixed days ago, sitting in a garage in Salinas waiting for him to reclaim it. But something kept him in these fields, something beyond curiosity or research. "My grandfather came from Italy with nothing," Dean said finally. "Couldn't speak English, had no skills anyone wanted, but he had dignity, and he had hope. These people, they have the same dignity, the same hope, but the system—" Dean gestured toward the foreman who was screaming at an elderly woman for working too slowly. "The system is designed to crush them." Roberto studied Dean's face. "You talk like someone who's never been crushed. Must be nice." That evening, Dean made a decision that would consume him for the next 4 years. Instead of returning to his comfortable life, he was going to do something to help these people. Not charity, not handouts, but real systemic change. First, he needed to understand the problem completely. Dean began working different farms throughout the Central Valley, always under the name Danny Cruz, always as just another desperate day laborer. He picked everything: grapes, tomatoes, strawberries, lettuce, almonds. He lived in worker camps, ate commodity food, and experienced every indignity that migrant workers endured. He learned that workers were routinely cheated on their pay, given wages below what was promised. He saw children as young as 10 working alongside their parents because families needed every hand to survive. He witnessed workers being sprayed with pesticides while they worked, then denied medical care when they got sick. But Dean also learned something else. These workers weren't powerless. They were organized, intelligent, and ready to fight for better conditions. They just needed resources and allies. "There's a man," Roberto told Dean one evening as they sat outside the worker barracks. "Cesar Chavez. He's trying to organize a union, get workers some protection. But the growers, they fight him with everything they have." Dean had heard of Chavez, the labor organizer, who was trying to create the United Farm Workers Union, but he'd never understood the courage it took for workers to risk everything, their jobs, their housing, their family's survival, to demand basic human rights. "What would it take," Dean asked, "to make the union work?" Roberto laughed. "Money, for one thing, legal support, and most of all, attention. The growers can crush us because nobody watches, nobody cares. If people saw what really happens here—" That night, Dean made a phone call that would change everything. "Frank, it's Dean. Dino, where the hell are you? You missed 3 recording sessions. I'm in the Central Valley. Frank, I need to ask you something, and I need you to take me seriously." "Okay, I'm listening." "What do you know about farm workers?" There was a pause. "Farm workers? Like people who pick fruit? People who pick the fruit you eat, who harvest the vegetables you order in restaurants, who do the hardest work in America for wages that wouldn't pay for your cigarettes." "Dino, what's this about?" Dean took a breath. "I've been working in the fields for a month, Frank, living like these people live, working like they work, and it's inhuman. They're being treated like slaves, and nobody knows because nobody looks." "You've been doing what?" working in the fields, and I'm not coming back to Hollywood until I do something about this." The silence stretched so long, Dean thought Frank had hung up. "Dino, are you having some kind of breakdown?" "No, Frank, I'm having a wake-up call. These people need help, and I'm in a position to help them." Over the next hour, Dean explained everything he'd seen and experienced. Frank listened without interrupting, and when Dean was finished, Frank was quiet for a long time. "What do you need?" Frank asked finally. "Money, a lot of money, legal support, and eventually publicity. But the right kind. Not charity porn, but real attention on the working conditions." "How much money?" Dean had done his homework. $500,000 to start, for legal funds, organizing expenses, and support for workers who get fired for union activity. Frank didn't hesitate. "You got it. But Dino, you better know what you're doing." Dean Martin's secret support of the United Farm Workers began in August 1963. Using intermediaries and shell companies, he funneled money to Cesar Chavez's organizing efforts, provided legal support for workers fighting wage theft, and funded a network of supporters throughout California's agricultural regions. But Dean's most important contribution wasn't financial. It was informational. Using his access to recording studios, he secretly documented the working conditions in various farms, creating an audio record of worker testimonies that would later become crucial evidence in legal battles. Roberto Delgado became Dean's closest collaborator, though Roberto didn't know his true identity for almost a year. Roberto thought Dean was simply an unusually committed fellow worker who seemed to have mysterious connections to lawyers and money. "Danny," Roberto said one evening in the spring of 1964, "I don't know who you really are, but you're not just some broke guy looking for work." Dean looked at his friend, because that's what Roberto had become. They'd worked side by side for almost a year, shared meals and stories, and Roberto had never asked for anything more than friendship and solidarity. "Why do you say that?" "Because broke guys don't have lawyers on speed dial. Because broke guys don't somehow always know which farms are about to get raided by immigration. Because broke guys don't speak English like they went to fancy schools." Dean realized the moment of truth had arrived. "Roberto, if I tell you something that might sound impossible, will you listen?" "I'm listening." "I'm Dean Martin." Roberto stared at him for a long moment, then started laughing. "Right, and I'm Frank Sinatra." Dean started singing "That's Amore" in his unmistakable voice. Roberto's laughter died. "Holy shit," Roberto whispered. "You're really... But why? Why would Dean Martin spend a year picking grapes?" "Because somebody had to care," Dean said simply. "And it turned out that somebody was me." Over the next 3 years, Dean's involvement in the farm workers movement deepened. He continued working in the fields periodically, always under his alias, but he also began using his influence in more strategic ways. When the UFW organized the Delano grape strike in 1965, Dean quietly pressured restaurant owners and grocery chains to stop buying non-union grapes. When workers needed medical care after pesticide exposure, Dean arranged for top doctors to treat them anonymously. When families faced eviction for union activity, Dean's foundation provided emergency housing. The most dramatic moment came in 1966, when Cesar Chavez organized a march from Delano to Sacramento to draw attention to the workers' cause. Dean wanted to join the march openly, but Chavez convinced him that his secret support was more valuable than his celebrity presence. "If you march with us," Chavez explained, "the story becomes about Dean Martin, not about the workers, but your support behind the scenes. That's what's keeping this movement alive." So Dean supported the march logistically, arranging for food, medical supplies, and legal observers along the route. He also used his connections to ensure sympathetic media coverage, though he never spoke to reporters himself. The march was successful, drawing national attention to the plight of farm workers and putting pressure on growers to negotiate. But Dean's most proud moment came when Roberto Delgado, now a union organizer himself, spoke at the rally in Sacramento. "We are not asking for charity," Roberto told the crowd of thousands. "We are demanding dignity. We are demanding the right to work without being poisoned, the right to earn wages we can live on, the right to be treated as human beings rather than disposable tools." Dean, watching from the back of the crowd in his Danny Cruz disguise, felt tears streaming down his face. His friend, this man he'd met picking grapes, was now a leader speaking truth to power on the steps of the state capitol, The movement achieved significant victories throughout the late 1960s. Growers began negotiating with the UFW, wages improved, and basic safety protections were implemented. But Dean knew the real measure of success was in individual lives changed. Roberto Delgado went back to teaching, but now he taught labor organizing and workers' rights. His daughter, whose fever had driven him to the fields in the first place, grew up healthy and strong, and eventually became a doctor specializing in occupational health. Carlos, Roberto's cousin, used skills he'd learned in the movement to become a community organizer in East Los Angeles. Dozens of other workers Dean had known became union representatives, small business owners, and community leaders. In 1970, as the UFW was becoming established and successful, Dean began gradually reducing his direct involvement, but his financial support continued through a private foundation that operated for the rest of his life. He made one final trip to the Central Valley in 1971, visiting Roberto and his family at their new home, the first house Roberto had ever owned. "You know what I learned working those fields?" Dean said, sitting in Roberto's kitchen, drinking coffee with a man who had become one of his closest friends. "What's that?" "That success means nothing if it's just about you. Real success is about creating opportunities for other people to succeed." Roberto smiled. "You want to know what I learned? That dignity isn't something you earn or deserve. It's something you have just by being human. The only question is whether other people recognize it." Dean's involvement in the farm workers movement remained largely secret during his lifetime. When people asked about his charitable work, he would mention other causes but never the years he'd spent in the fields or the millions of dollars he'd contributed to labor organizing. The truth didn't emerge until after Dean's death in 1995, when Cesar Chavez's papers were made public. Among them were hundreds of letters from Dean's foundation, documenting his support and expressing his deep respect for the courage of farm workers. Roberto Delgado, by then a retired teacher and grandfather, spoke at Dean's memorial service in Los Angeles. "Most people remember Dean Martin as an entertainer," Roberto said. "But I remember him as Danny Cruz, a man who worked beside me in the grape fields, who listened to our stories, who shared our struggles. Dean could have spent those years on movie sets and in recording studios. Instead, he chose to spend them bent over in the dirt with people society had forgotten. Dean taught me that solidarity isn't just a word, it's a choice you make every day. The choice to see other people's suffering as your own responsibility. The choice to use whatever privilege you have to lift up people who have none." Roberto paused, looking out at the crowd of celebrities and politicians who had come to honor Dean Martin. "I know most of you love Dean the entertainer, but I love Danny Cruz, the man who proved that real class has nothing to do with money or fame. Real class is about how you treat people when nobody's watching, how you fight for justice when there's nothing in it for you." Today, the United Farm Workers Union continues to represent agricultural workers throughout the United States. In the UFW headquarters in Bakersfield, there's a small plaque that reads, "In memory of all those who stood with us in the fields, known and unknown, famous and forgotten, all united in the belief that every worker deserves dignity." Among the names listed is Danny Cruz, Dean Martin, 1963-1971, a friend who never forgot where real wealth comes from. The story of Dean Martin's secret life as a farm worker reminds us that sometimes the most important work happens not on stages or in studios, but in places where society's most vulnerable people labor unseen and unappreciated. Dean Martin entertained millions, but his greatest performance may have been in the grape fields of California, where he learned that true solidarity means working alongside people, not just working for them, where he discovered that the real American dream isn't about individual success, but about creating conditions where everyone has the chance to build a dignified life. In the end, the King of Cool's most revolutionary act wasn't anything he did in a tuxedo. It was bending his back under the California sun, proving that justice isn't something you sing about, it's something you sweat for.